Okay, welcome back. Let's talk about Japan. So Japan, like I said, is very influenced by China in a lot of ways. The Japanese writing system comes out of the Chinese writing system, but the languages are actually quite separate. The Japanese language is more related to languages from sort of the middle of Asia, where China, it comes from a completely separate tradition. But Japan has its own unique culture as well. The sort of big Japanese religion is known as Shinto. And this is kind of the folk tradition of just worshiping the gods. So you can kind of translate the Shinto as the way of the gods, or alternatively, the way of the spirits. The Japanese word kami is not easy to translate into one or the other. It's kind of both or something in between. So Shinto is all about having a good relationship with these kami. There's a lot of sort of traditional Japanese mythology, including the story of the creation of the universe. The sun goddess Amaterasu is said to be the ancestor of the Japanese emperor, so that becomes pretty important. But a lot of the time, Shinto is just about cultivating a relationship between human beings and the Japanese gods or kami. So these sort of nature spirits dwell in various parts of the landscape. You know, there's the spirit of the river, there's the spirit of the mountain. And, you know, the way to live a good life is to have a positive relationship with these spirits. And so the big thing in Japan is shrines in specific locations to the spirits of the mountain or the forest or the river or anything like that. And so you would, you know, give food to the spirit, you would do rituals for that spirit. And basically the important thing is to just show that entity the proper respect, to understand it and its place in the universe and your place in relationship to it. You don't have to be a monk to do these rituals, but monks are kind of going to be in charge of them. And then everybody else is going to, you know, do them on specific days or specific holidays. Now, the interesting thing is when Buddhism comes into Japan, that also becomes very popular. And again, the Bodhisattva idea is pretty compatible with this idea of the kami. Maybe a kami could also be interpreted as a particular bodhisattva or vice versa. And there's also an emphasis on, you know, taking care of each other and the spirits, you know, giving good things to human beings. Shinto temples are often most recognized by their very distinctive gates, which are called torii. And so the torii have become kind of a symbol of Shinto religion. Now, there's two big periods in Japan that I want to talk about. One of them is the Heian period. So the Heian period is kind of one of the two really thriving ages of Japanese culture. And this is a time period where Japan is pretty well connected to China. And, you know, we're talking about the 700s to 1100s here. So, you know, think about sort of the second half of the Middle Ages in Europe. This is a time when Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism are coming into Japan. And this is when Japan has its own emperors. So a city known as Heian is really important. Today, Heian is known as Kyoto. That city has continued to be important. But during this time period, there's an emperor who is theoretically in charge and rules from his palace at Heian. But there's really a sort of powerful family that's behind him. He's more of a figurehead. And it's the Fujiwara clan who are really the ones who are really important. And various forms of Buddhism are probably the most popular of the Chinese religions coming in. And this is a time when there's a lot of art and a lot of people, a lot of literature and people trying to impress each other with the arts. Now, the interesting thing is that that men are educated in Chinese. You know, they are taught, you know, to write the same kind of Chinese poetry as being is written in China because, you know, they're being treated as more important. Women are not taught Chinese. They don't learn Chinese. So they have to write poems and literature in Japanese. But later on, when Japan kind of breaks away from China a little bit more, people start thinking, hey, maybe it's actually better to write our poems in our own language than to write them in Chinese. Maybe it's actually cooler to write Japanese art and literature than to write Chinese stuff. And so these women their work ends up being really important to, you know, to Japan's sort of national literature. And one of these artists is Lady Murasaki. She wrote diaries of life as a sort of noble lady in this court, and she also wrote a story called The Tale of Genji, which is a fictional work, and really arguably the first psychological novel. Because ancient poems like epics, things like the ancient Odyssey and the Iliad, stuff like that, they don't tend to go into so much depth of how their characters are thinking and feeling. But Lady Murasaki really does. She, really dives into Genji's psychology and tries to understand him as a person. So she is pushing sort of the limits of art forward and creating something much more to the kind of thing that we'd want to read today pick it up in a bookstore. So Tale of Genji, still a great read today, totally recommended. And the funny thing is that, like I say, they use the Chinese writing system, but they use it to write a completely different language, Japanese. So, which is kind of why Japanese is hard to learn, because it's using writing that's not really adapted to the vocabulary that people speak. So that's the Heian period. It's a sort of romantic time with a lot going on in terms of art and the nobles trying to create all this art. Then later on, we enter into the shogunate period. So there's the Kamakura shogunate and the Tokugawa shogunate. Both of these times, and I think, the Tokugawa shogunate is much later on, but both of these times, we have what's known as a shogun. And the shogun is like a general if the general took over the country or the region. In theory, the emperor is supposed to appoint the shogun, but actually, once again, the emperor is just kind of a puppet during this time period, and the shogun is the guy who's really in charge. And so this can, there's a lot of fights between different shoguns and clashes of power. But the really fascinating thing is that in Japan, they seem to have, during this time period, independently reinvented the feudal system. So you again have this system of powerful landowners who have these knights who they grant land to these knights. Only here, these knights are known as samurai. Once again, these are warriors who have a kind of code of honor and a way of life that's all about going to war and being these sort of trained leaders. And they round up the peasants who work on their land, and they go to battle with the other samurai. So the samurai, are constantly going to war with each other, but sometimes they go to war on behalf of the landowner, who in some cases might be the shogun. So that's pretty interesting that there are some strong similarities there. There are some differences too, but primarily, historians have noted this, and they have sometimes been attempted to call it Japanese feudalism during the shogunate. Like the knights, the samurai have a code of honor. Knights have chivalry, basically, but the samurai go one step further and they write it down into the code of Bushido. You're not supposed to fight people in a dishonorable way. Now, in practice, probably a lot of people did, but this was the ideal that they strove for. Was if someone is surrenders, don't just execute him. If someone is in a position where he's not able to fight back, that's not a fair fight. So you should strive for a fair fight. And if you dishonor yourself, you have to basically, commit an honorable self-execution by dragging a sword through your guts. That's the ideal anyway. Not everybody lived up to that. But there's a lot of emphasis on honor among the samurai. Later on, when we have the later shogunate, the samurai again return, only this is a time period where people actually have guns. So it's a different kind of samurai. It's samurai with guns, and they don't really disappear until the end of the 1800s. So they're contemporary with cowboys, which is pretty wild. But yeah, samurai, very important. The samurai are sort of honored for protecting Japan against the invasion of a people known as the Mongols. We're going to talk about the Mongols later on when we get to the later history of China. But in Japan, the samurai help drive them off. They also have help from a divine wind. Wind, which is, blows the Mongol ships away and keeps them from invading the islands of Japan. And a divine wind is known as a kamikaze. So when later on Japan has like fighter pilots, that are, basically doing these suicide missions. They name them after this divine wind. The last thing I want to talk about for Japan is its theater scene. So Japan has quite a strong tradition, China does too in other ways, of theater. Now this is not quite theater as we would understand it. This is theater with, it's very slow paced, let's say that. And the stories don't tend to be super psychological. They tend to be more archetypal. So you have these sort of big characters who are kind of playing out these roles that everybody recognizes, like the grieving widow or the sort of stubborn general or things like that. And these performances are all done with masks. And the no mask is very interesting in that they're designed to be, if you angle your head differently, you can sort of make it look like you have different facial expressions. So you can be joyful, but then you tilt your head down and you're angry or you're sad, stuff like that. And there's music players on stage, so it's a bit of a musical performance as well. But they usually last for quite a long time, sometimes up to 6 hours at probably the maximum. In a similar vein, we have kabuki, which is a little bit more wild. The name kabuki almost means something like avant-garde or strange theater. And in kabuki, originally women were involved, and sometimes the performances could be kind of erotic. But eventually, women were banned from performing, possibly out of fears that these were just pornography. So they eventually became plays where men played all the roles. I believe that's true of kabuki. It's not always true of no theater. But in kabuki, men played all the roles like Shakespeare. And when we get to Shakespeare, we will compare him to these kabuki plays a little bit. So both of these are part of an important sort of theatrical tradition that is still very popular to this day in Japan. So that's a little taste of Japanese culture. Obviously, there's quite a lot more we could go into with all of these different cultures and civilizations. But a lot of the major developments are happening during this time period while Europe is going through its Middle Ages. Okay, one more area of the world I want to talk about for this time period, and that's India. So I will see you guys in the next video for that one.